The blood of a giant never dries without leaving a trace. When Goliath fell, the crash of his armor echoed far beyond the battlefield, awakening a silent oath within the walls of Gath. Israel moved on, celebrating victories and crowning kings, but forgot that hatred is patient. The family of the fallen giant sought more than war. They sought retribution. In the shadows of the Philistine city, a new champion was chosen to bear that burden. He was raised on tales of humiliation and trained to become the very antithesis of the King of Israel. As David grew older and the vigor of youth abandoned him, this predator honed his weapons, waiting for the moment when the shepherd would become a slower prey. The attack was no mere clash of armies. It was a hunt planned over decades. The warrior who finally emerged from the crowd was an abomination of flesh and steel, a colossus carrying upon his shoulders the weight of an extinct age, and at the tip of his spear the king's appointed death. That was the fatal moment when human frailty collided with ancestral fury. We are about to relive the most tense fragment of that hidden war. The point where the past demands its due, and faith is tested at its very limit. We leave behind the ancient triumph of Elah to step now into a more perilous ground. The place where survival itself requires a miracle. Welcome to the Valley of Redemption. The duel that made David a symbol did not end the story of the warriors of Gath. It merely revealed the surface of a lineage that for generations remained hidden within Philistine walls. Behind the brief narratives rises the suggestion of a distinct people, shaped within fortified cities where iron was worked with unusual precision for that age. Instruments of war sharpened by hands accustomed to the impossible. Spears too long for ordinary soldiers, swords capable of tearing through armor and flesh with equal ease, cuirasses fitted to torsos of a width that defied the understanding of anyone who had never seen men of such stature. This command of metal was no improvisation. It resulted from knowledge transmitted with rigid discipline, preserved in military rites that combined strength, endurance, and a cultural memory, unwilling to vanish even after bloody confrontations with Israel. Goliath's death, impactful as it was, did not disperse that inheritance. On the contrary, it ignited a silent fire within Gath itself, where families tied to the giant interpreted his fall not as defeat, but as insult. Among the peoples of the region, when a warrior regarded as sacred was slain, the responsibility for retribution fell upon his closest relatives. This ancient and exacting custom required no political summons. It was driven by codes so deep that they crossed beliefs and survived even in times of exile or destruction. Thus, when Goliath fell and his head was carried as a sign of triumph, the need for vengeance spread among those who shared his blood like a spark touching the depths of an abandoned mine. In those days, Gath remained a Philistine bastion strategically positioned before Israel. Its walls were thick, and its homes reflected the skill of seasoned craftsmen capable of drawing from iron a precision that tormented neighboring armies. There, young warriors grew beneath the weight of ancient stories, trained to uphold the name of their houses and reinforce the reputation of a city feared since the days of the Anakim. Many inhabitants of Gath carried with pride the memory of ancient peoples described in scattered accounts, men of great height, descendants of an age that had survived through fragmented lineages preserved like living relics of antiquity. Among these families arose warriors who understood that their strength served a legacy far older than the kings and borders of their age. They embodied the continuation of an ancestral covenant, merging strict military discipline with traditions the rest of the world had long forgotten. There, every battle became a ritual, and every forged weapon carried the weight of a history older than the warrior himself. In that environment were shaped men capable of bearing inhuman burdens and wielding spears that defied the imagination of any adversary. Goliath's lineage, therefore, did not vanish with his fall. It retreated into the depths of the city, reorganized itself, transmitted its techniques, and waited for the moment to honor his memory before the gods they believed had formed them. David, meanwhile, followed his path towards the throne, fighting wars, securing alliances, and carrying the mark of a reign guided by faith. But while he advanced, the heirs of that ancient house walked in parallel, watching the man who had turned the death of a giant into a symbol. For them, that symbol needed to be broken. The story would only be complete when the king's blood touched the earth as payment for the offense committed in Elah. The world that emerges from the verses of Samuel transcends political and military disputes, revealing a truly mythological nature. There, one era was dying, so another could be born. Those certain shadows refused to vanish. While Israel rejoiced in victory, a silent threat was rising on the opposite frontier, forged by the memory of a fallen giant and the wrath of a lineage unable to forget. The true beginning of that conflict precedes the lifting of Ishbi-Benob's spear. It was born the moment an entire city learned to breathe again. Those who believe that Gath buried Goliath are mistaken. The city did not lay him to rest. It fortified his legacy. Within Gath, young descendants of that lineage were trained with this purpose in mind. It was not enough to raise spears or endure heavy armor. They had to learn stories, codes, and rituals reaching back to times when tales were told of giant peoples scattered across valleys and fortresses. Goliath was the most recognized face of that heritage, but not the only one. The house that shaped him considered itself a continuation of the ancient Rephaim, remnants of an age that refused to be erased from memory. The fall of the giant before an Israelite shepherd became mandatory instruction in the city's military training spaces. The episode was not narrated as an irreversible defeat, but as a turning point that demanded a more calculated response. If a youth without armor had been able to expose the vulnerability of their champion, vengeance could not depend solely on brute strength. The successor would need to unite stature, technique, and strategy. He would have to become more than a warrior. He would need to turn himself into a deliberate instrument of humiliation against the emerging king of Israel. As David advanced in his own path, Gath's gaze remained fixed upon him. Reports of battles, victories, movements, and internal crises were observed closely. The objective was not admiration. but calculation. The Hebrew king had become the symbol of something the lineage found intolerable: the notion that a people without giants could challenge a world shaped by men of ancient blood. The answer would not come in the heat of immediate vengeance, but at the proper time, when age, exhaustion, and the marks of war would render the former shepherd more vulnerable. Thus, while Israel saw in David the fulfillment of promises, Gath saw the passage of time as a weapon. The city prepared its own champion with patience, as one sharpens a blade destined for a single strike. The chosen descendant needed to grow beneath the weight of two memories: that of a brother fallen in Elah, and that of a lineage that refused to accept that its story might end in the hands of a king chosen by another god. From this mixture of pride, mourning, and strategy emerged the figure the biblical records would describe as one of the descendants of the giant. A man whose existence cannot be understood merely as part of the Philistine army, but as the culmination of years of silent preparation. When this figure finally took shape, the city believed it had found the means to restore the balance. Ancient blood had not forgotten the stone that struck Goliath. It waited for the moment to return the blow, not in the valley where the first giant fell, but on a battlefield where the king was no longer young, where the strength of faith would meet the weight of age and the ripened vengeance of an entire lineage. Gath did not forget. Gath waited. And while Israel saw only another Philistine threat rising on the horizon, a far older story marched towards David, carrying upon its shoulders the desire to end with iron and bronze, the chapter that had begun with that first fall. The years separating the Valley of Elah from this new battlefield had transformed everything. David was no longer the youth who ran without hesitation towards a giant. He now carried crowns, victories won, alliances secured, and scars that no song celebrated. Even so, he insisted on remaining at the front of his army, leading men who had grown up in the shadow of his courage. Scripture describes this period with discretion, yet a careful reading reveals the ware-gathering around the king. Each campaign demanded more from a body already tired and from a spirit that no longer found rest with the same ease. Israel faced constant pressure. The Philistines advanced and withdrew in cycles of hostility that seemed endless, as if testing not only the strength of the kingdom, but of the king himself. In this landscape, David remained present, holding his sword with determination, still able to inspire his men, yet feeling the weight of decades of conflict. The biblical narrative does not dramatize this weakness. It unveils it in a single phrase: the king began to grow faint. And within that detail, the story changes its tone. A weariness not born of fear, but of the inevitable accumulation of battles, wounds, and responsibilities no man can carry forever. Amid this growing vulnerability, the approaching enemy was no ordinary commander. He was the descendant prepared in silence, shaped to complete the vengeance forged since Goliath's fall. The presence of this Philistine warrior on the battlefield does not appear as a sudden threat, but as a response matured through years of waiting. The strength of his lineage walked beside a strategy that knew exactly when to reveal itself. And when the Philistines reorganized for yet another confrontation, this descendant did not merely march with them. He watched, calculated, and chose the moment when the Hebrew king would show signs of weakness. David fought as he always had, but his breath no longer found its rhythm. His vision wavered between clarity and shadow. The hand that once held the sling with precision now sought stability on the weight of the sword. And as the army clashed around him, the towering figure began to advance through the chaos of battle, guided by a purpose not tied to the war itself, but to the rare opportunity to extinguish the man who had humiliated his house. The scene forming between the verses is silent and heavy. On one side, an aging king who still refuses to retreat from his post. On the other, a warrior molded to kill. There is no spectacle, no proclamation, only approach. The Philistine descendants' movements reveal no uncontrollable fury, but precision. He did not see David as a monarch or as a hero. He saw him as a target who had finally lost the advantage of youth. And in the instant when the king stumbles, the narrative reaches its most fragile point. The threat was neither symbolic nor distant. It was physical, immediate, and mortal. The giant raised his weapon with the conviction of one who believed he was about to conclude a cycle begun years earlier, when an unknown shepherd struck down his relative before all Israel. The balance between past and present tilted dangerously. A single blow would have been enough to end the reign chosen by God. It is at this threshold that the chapter closes, in the space between the giant's advance and the king's impending fall, where the story holds its breath before revealing who, in the end, will remain standing. When the descendant of Gath broke through the line of soldiers, the battle lost its sound. Everything around seemed to drift into the distance as that figure advanced, carrying the weight of a story older than the kingdom of Israel itself. The bronze of his spear caught the uneven light of the battlefield, revealing the terrifying size of the weapon and the strength required to wield it. Nothing about that warrior was ordinary. His measured steps, his posture, and the way he studied David gave the sense that the entire preparation of his lineage converged upon this single moment. David, surrounded by the chaos of combat, tried to maintain his rhythm, but his body already betrayed the passing of years. His hands responded more slowly, his reflexes searched for precision they could no longer reach, and his vision wavered between clarity and shadow. The men fighting beside him noticed his exhaustion, yet none imagined that within that confusion, a concealed champion was advancing with mortal purpose. The giant was not driven by impulse. He calculated every step, closing the distance as one approaches an inevitable conclusion. The biblical narrative records it simply. David began to grow faint, and the giant thought he could kill him. This brief line contains an entire abyss. As David stumbled and tried to regain his breath, the descendant raised his weapon for the final blow. The metallic point of the spear seemed far too heavy to belong to any ordinary man, and that weapon, forged to pierce armor, now tilted towards the king's chest. The story moved towards an ending too terrible to accept, as though the lamp of Israel was about to be extinguished before all eyes. The inner silence preceding the attack was nearly absolute. The giant drew back his arm, preparing the strike that would erase the memory of the Valley of Elah. His expression revealed no wild hatred, but conviction. To him, this blow was not merely vengeance for Goliath's fall. It was the restoration of a broken order, the chance to prove that the ancient lineage still possessed strength enough to challenge the God who upheld Israel's throne. In that critical instant, the king's human frailty became undeniable. David, who had once felled a colossus with unshakable faith, now struggled simply to remain standing. The fall that once seemed impossible approached like an inevitable shadow. And for a moment, everything pointed to the giant completing the work his kinsman could not. The chapter closes upon that threshold, upon the fatal approach, the raised weapon, the weight of a lineage about to descend upon the chosen king. A single second separated Israel from a fate that would have reshaped its history. The blade gleamed, the arm fell, and the future waited for the impact. The descendant of Gath was already upon David when the battlefield seemed to revolve around them. The heavy spear fell with the certainty of one who believed he was fulfilling a destiny awaited for years. Dust, clashing metal, and the cries around them faded into a distant hum before that scene focused on a single outcome: the lamp of Israel about to be crushed beneath the weight of an ancient lineage. Among the men fighting, one pair of eyes perceived what the others had not yet seen. Abishai, David's nephew, recognized in the king's faltering step a danger that could not be ignored. Accustomed to following the monarch through successive campaigns, he knew the rhythm of his movements and the strength that still lingered in his arms. What he saw there was not mere exhaustion. It was the limit. Without waiting for command or weighing the risk, he broke through the line of combat and hurled himself towards the giant. The distance separating him from the descendant of Gath seemed far too great to be crossed in time, yet urgency made his steps faster than fear. While the Colossus adjusted the weight of his weapon for the final strike, Abishai's figure entered the giant's path like a living blade. He did not advance seeking personal glory. He advanced to prevent the story from ending in a death that could never be accepted as a simple consequence of war. The impact was direct. Abishai's sword found the gap between the metal of the cuirass and the exposed flesh, piercing the blind spot of the giant's confidence. The massive body wavered like a fortress struck at its foundations, and the spear that was descending to kill David veered off course, driving itself into the earth beside the king. The sound of iron striking soil echoed like a reversed sentence. What was meant to be an ending became the breaking of vengeance. David regained his breath as he watched the descendant of Gath fall before him. Not by his own hand, but by the hand of a man who had grown under his leadership. The lineage that sought to restore Goliath's honor encountered in that moment a barrier not found in the strength of a single hero, but in the loyalty of a generation shaped in the king's shadow. Abishai did more than save a life. He preserved the symbol that sustained the heart of Israel. After this event, David's men understood that they could no longer allow the king to stand at the front as before. His presence was not merely strategic, it was spiritual. To leave him exposed would be to endanger something far greater than military command. They surrounded him with a silent pact, fully aware that if the lamp were extinguished at that point in history, the entire nation would stagger with it. The giant's blood mixed with the dust of the field, and with it a fragment of the past was broken. The lineage of Gath had failed in its attempt to close the cycle opened in Elah. But that failure did not end the series. Other heirs of that same blood remained, and the fall of each one would mark the final extinction of a world that tried to survive within the borders of the Promised Land. The death of the giant who nearly struck David down did not end the threat. It was only the beginning of a revealing sequence. Scripture records 4 battles, all close in time, all against men of unusual stature linked to the same lineage of Gath. Taken separately, they seem like brief notes. Together they reveal a silent process. Israel was erasing the last vestiges of an earlier world. The first to appear was Saph, a warrior whose mere presence altered the rhythm of combat. His size and weaponry recalled the tradition of the ancient Rephaim. But the victory of Sibbecai, one of Israel's seasoned soldiers, proved decisive in breaking the aura that surrounded these descendants. The fall of Saph did not bring astonishment. It brought understanding. The physical strength that had defined generations of giants was no longer enough to resist a people who fought guided by conviction and purpose. Another descendant arose in the next battle. The narrative preserves few details about him, but it notes that he carried heavy weapons similar to those used by the house of Goliath. Elhanan, son of Jair, was the one who halted his advance. The swiftness of the encounter showed that Israel was learning to face such adversaries without surrendering to the terror once associated with them. They were no longer seen as exceptional beings, but as warriors whose strength could be overcome. The third giant was the most unsettling. He had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 on each foot, a feature described in some traditions as a hereditary mark of ancient families, preserving mutations from extinct lineages. He challenged Israel openly, as if expecting to rekindle the fear Goliath had stirred years earlier. But Jonathan, son of Shimea, advanced against him without hesitation and ended the fight directly. The fall of this adversary sealed something deeper, the perception that the lineage of giants was in irreversible collapse. When these battles are read as part of a sequence, they reveal the transition of an era. They were not merely military confrontations. They were surgical cuts, severing the final roots of a people whose existence carried memories of a past predating the kingdoms. Since the days of Moses, the promise that God would remove the peoples of great stature remained both a theological and historical statement. Now, before the eyes of David's warriors, that ancient word was being fulfilled silently, without speeches, only in the sound of weapons striking the ground. These victories strengthened something greater than Israel's defenses. They consolidated David's legacy. The man who had felled the first giant had inspired an entire generation capable of defeating the last. Even weakened, the king had forged an army that did not fight through physical might, but through conviction shaped over years. Each fallen giant demonstrated that the terror associated with their lineage no longer held space in the new reality taking shape. When the last one fell, the battlefield sank into a stillness that seemed to mark the end of an ancient chapter. It was not merely the defeat of exceptional warriors. It was the closing of a story whose origins reached back before the flood, according to traditions that spoke of remnants of colossal peoples. With their death, Philistia lost part of its military identity. Israel, on the other hand, crossed the threshold dividing the world of ancient shadows from the world that would be shaped by covenant and by the stability of David's reign. In that moment, as the men gathered their weapons and watched the silence settle upon the earth, one truth stood firm. The lineage that once challenged Israel had come to an end. The past that insisted on surviving had been interrupted, and the kingdom advanced, finally free from the last shadows that had followed its story since the Valley of Elah. When the dust of battle finally settled, Israel was not celebrating mere military victories. It was witnessing the quiet end of an era that had stubbornly endured since ancient times. The lineage that surrounded Goliath, upheld by ancestral pride and the remnants of a forgotten world, at last came to a halt before the men shaped under David's leadership. The king, already marked by age, did not strike down the last giants with his own hands, yet his faith had formed those who did. With the fall of the heirs of Gath, the shadows that had followed Israel since the Valley of Elah began to lose their strength. The frailty that nearly extinguished the light of the kingdom became a testimony. Even when the giant does not fall by the king's own blow, the purpose endures. And so, amid gathered weapons and sacred silence, the final chapter of the giants in the land came to a close. The past receded, the destiny moved forward.